This, the Alfa Romeo Tonale Veloce plug-in hybrid, is the brand's first hybrid car, and it's a pretty important one. The Tonale is already taking up half of Alfa Romeo's sales in Australia, and even though that's not exactly blowing the numbers up, it means that this car has the potential to win the hearts of a lot of enthusiasts that may have been turned off the brand in recent years. Anyone who doesn't already own a Stelvio SUV or a Giulia sedan might be looking for something new from the brand, and this could be it. If you're thinking an Alfa Romeo plug-in hybrid is probably going to be pretty pricey, you are not wrong. This one, being at the top of the 3 variant range, is the most expensive, obviously, the other 2 being front-wheel drive mild hybrids. They kind of go up against the likes of the BMW X1 in terms of pricing, size, and European styling, but this one is more than 20 grand more expensive. Before on-road costs, this car costs $78,500, but with its Alpha Red paint and 20-inch wheels as cost-optional extras, this car here costs $81,990. It's not a small hit to the wallet, really.
Alfa Romeo says the difference between the mild hybrid and the plug-in hybrid on paper isn't actually as big as it seems when you consider the customers that will opt for extra options with extra costs in the mild hybrid versus the stuff that comes as standard with the plug-in. One of the main additions for the plug-in hybrid over the mild hybrid is a pack called the Lusso pack, which adds a lot of comfort stuff in the interior that I'll get to when we're sitting in the car later. But even the non-plug-in version of the Veloce has a few good things that come with it. The Brembo brake calipers behind the wheels, the aluminium paddle shifters behind the steering wheel, the tinted privacy glass, and even its active dual-stage valve suspension, which is basically what Alfa Romeo calls its adjustable sports suspension. The Veloce mild hybrid also gets the same level 2 autonomous driving gear as the plug-in, which includes things like the intelligent adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assist, traffic jam assist, and it even comes with surround view cameras for parking as well as parking sensors.
Having said that about the pricing, there is one thing to consider, and that's this. That this is an Alfa Romeo, and that means there's probably going to be a subset of people that'll consider this car just on that fact. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because look at it, it looks great. There's a lot of old Alfa references in this car, and even, a few modern links to the other 2 models in Alfa's range, the Stelvio and the Giulia. Of course, the 3-part shield and horizontal lines at the front where the grills are, but also, if you look at the headlights and you're a bit of an Alfa buff, you'll probably think that they look a little bit like the Alfa Romeo SZ Coupe, and that's because they're meant to. Of course, the offset number plate holder is also a pretty good sporty Italian look, and if we step around to the side, those 20-inch wheels that I mentioned earlier are the telephone dial style circular inserts. Even the 19s, the smaller wheels that you can get on this car, are the same circular inserts with a different design. Also, while I'm talking about Alfa Romeo design elements being modernized, look at that, it's the little snake from the Alfa Romeo logo, but it's got a plug for a head instead of a snake head. Also, it's on this side of the car that the plug is actually on, so if you ever forget, you can just look for your little snake friend there. It's cute. I like it. The other thing up the back that is specific to the plug-in hybrid are the dual exhaust exits with chrome tips that just give it that extra little bit of a sporty look. Even the parts in here that are standard across the range for the Tonale are quite nice. For example, this steering wheel is basically straight out of the Stelvio and Giulia, and it's a steering wheel I really like. As a sports car wheel, it's got quite a good 9:3 position to slide your thumbs into. It's got little markers all around that you can feel if you're not looking at it when you're steering, and the buttons are quite clear, even including the engine start and stop button on the wheel, which is a nice sporty touch as well. The DNA selector down here is still visible, it's not hidden behind anything, and it's within reach, easy to turn. Right in the middle of it as well is that button to adjust the suspension stiffness if you're in dynamic mode, if you want to soften things up. Speaking of buttons, it's good that there's still a lot of physical buttons for the climate controls. You don't need to go through the multimedia screen to do most of the adjustment for things like the fan speed, the temperature, and which fans are active. Although if you want to activate the heated and cooled seats, you do have to use the Uconnect 5 system, which, like I said, has an Alfa Romeo skin on it. It's actually a pretty good system overall, although I found it sometimes a little bit laggy, especially when using Android Auto wirelessly while my phone's been on the charger pad, which is down below it. As with most hybrids or electrified cars, there are a series of menus in the multimedia screen that you can go through to look at things like how the hybrid system's performing, how much electric driving you've done versus petrol driving. I've done quite a lot of petrol driving this week. Some of the performance figures and some gauges that you can use to see what is going on while you're actually driving. Speaking of which, the driver binnacle in front of me has this nice little double-cowled, racy looking design, even though it's kind of just a hard, scratchy plastic over the top. But I think it looks pretty good. You can change the visual settings for some of the driver displays, which is entirely digital. There's no actual physical gauges. Ergonomically in here, I'm finding that sometimes my sitting position doesn't feel quite right. It's pretty close. But one thing that has been bothering me probably more than I expected it to is that as I'm sitting at the wheel, it feels like I'm a little bit too far into the center of the car. This elbow has a place to rest quite nicely. This elbow, I feel like I need to lean a little bit too far over to the right to actually find a spot to lean. There's about, 5 centimeters too much space between me and the door. But everything else about the visibility and my sitting position in here is pretty nice. In terms of places to put things, the 2 cup holders that are here are pretty well positioned and placed. They're sort of out of the way, although there's like little rubber holder grip things in there to stop things from moving around too much, I think, or to stop anything that's just a little bit narrow from wobbling around. The problem is with my pretty normal sized water bottle, I think it is a little bit too much friction and you kind of have to tap it in and give it a yank to pull it out. Anyone who's holding a hot cup of coffee in there and trying to get that out might end up with a little bit of a burn. Down here in the center, it's a pretty narrow but tall bin for storage. I've got a few things down there, but it goes most of the way down my arm. Fine if you want to store a lot of little things, but maybe bulkier items. Probably better stored in here in the glove box. I think it looks quite nice in here, and even though some of the surfaces are maybe not quite up to literal scratch, I think if you spent 80 grand on a small SUV and end up with this, you probably wouldn't be too disappointed. For a small SUV sitting behind my own 5'10" seating position, I've got actually a surprising amount of knee room, and I mentioned the sloping roof earlier, but unless I do this, I don't really have any chance of hitting my head on the roof. It's actually quite spacious for someone who's a pretty normal heighted adult. The seat headrest behind me is pretty comfortable. I can put my feet kind of down far enough that I get a little bit of underleg support as well. And the good thing is I also get an armrest with cup holders in the middle of it as well. There's also a little hole to put long items through the back of the split fold seat as well, which is 60/40. The other good thing about the back seat in here is that you get a USB-A and a USB-C charger as well, plus 2 separate directional vents for each of the back passengers. If you do find yourself with about 80 grand to spend on a car, the good thing is you don't have to lift up the tailgate yourself, it's automatic. The bad thing though is that because you've bought a plug-in hybrid, you don't get as much boot space as the other versions of the Tonale have. Those have 500 litres of boot space, but this one only 385, and that's because underneath there's apparently about 125 litres of battery. It also means that even though you get these little clicky hook bits to keep the floor up, you don't get a spare space saver tyre. Instead, there's only a repair kit in there alongside the bag that the cable for charging comes in. Under here is a 1.3 litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine that on its own makes 132 kilowatts and 270 newton meters. That doesn't sound enough to blow your socks off, but it's also got an electric output of 90 kilowatts and 250 newton meters. Alfa Romeo quotes its overall output at 208 kilowatts, which is pretty good for a small SUV. In fact, it's good enough that Alfa Romeo says you can get this thing from 0 to 100 in just 6.2 seconds. That's kind of hot hatch territory. That's not bad. This is where things get pretty important for the fact that this is an Alfa Romeo. When you're on the road and behind the wheel, you want to feel like you're driving something a little bit special. And if you've just spent near on 80 grand, you probably want to feel like it's a little bit sporty. That's where criticism of the other 2 versions of the Tonale were kind of leveled a little bit at the fact that it was just a bit underwhelming, especially it was a front wheel drive with not that much power. but with 208 kilowatts and all-wheel drive underneath this one, feels a little bit more brisk. It feels like a small SUV that is trying to be a sports car rather than just a small SUV that looks a bit like a sports car. Like I mentioned, the acceleration is pretty good, and when you find a windy road, you don't find yourself waiting for the car to catch up as much, especially with that hybrid system helping along at the rear wheels. And if you are on a windy road, you'll probably find that there are a few elements to the driving aspect of the Tonale plug-in that are a little bit sporty. For a start, its steering rack is pretty quick. It's only a couple of turns lock to lock. I think it's a 14.1-to-1 steering ratio, which means that even though the steering itself isn't super feelsome, you don't have to turn the wheel very hard once you're at high speeds to actually get the car to turn in pretty quickly. And when it does, it handles it pretty well. Given the platform that it's built on isn't bespoke to this car or even to Alfa Romeo, they've done a pretty good job of making it feel pretty fun and handling quite well. It's not amazing, but there's nothing really vitally wrong with it. A couple of other little things, the braking as well, it's braking by wire and it doesn't feel super engaging, but it does pull the car up quickly enough if you need it to. On the braking though, I think the Tonale plug-in could do with a little bit more in the way of regenerative braking. It does have these giant aluminium paddles behind the wheel, and driving a hybrid with paddles usually means you have something behind there to adjust how much braking you get, but in this case the paddles are actually just there for the gearbox, which is fine, but the gearbox itself probably does actually need a little bit of direction sometimes, especially when you're doing some spirited driving. Another small flaw you might notice from the driver's seat while you're moving along is that in this car in particular, and it's not something I can say of every Tonale, but the plastic on the dash does rattle just a little bit, especially when you have no radio on, the air conditioning turned down, and all you're listening to is the sound of your own voice talking about the car to a camera. And it seems like those rattles come thanks to a suspension tune that, while not really letting the car feel unsettled or jostled by big bumps, an uneven and relatively smooth road with small imperfections in it, you can really feel it. I've got the suspension right now in its softer setting, and I feel like I can feel that the road underneath me isn't particularly even. It's quite a constant vibration in the car. I should mention that when you change the drive mode into D for dynamic on the DNA drive mode selector, it does automatically choose the stiffer suspension setting, which does kind of accentuate some of the bumps a little bit, but it also makes the car feel just a little bit more planted. Driving in dynamic mode around town doesn't really make sense to me. It makes the suspension a little bit too jittery, and it does make the gearbox as well probably a little bit too eager for low speeds. Having yourself in first and second gear for most of the way up to 60 k's an hour just doesn't really work when you're in traffic. Alfa Romeo's spec sheet says this car has a 60.5 kilometer electric driving range, and while in the real world that's probably not exact, I've found that the electric battery power for this car hasn't really been draining that quickly. I haven't actually run it down, and I've only needed to charge it overnight once in the week that I've had it. Of course, when I took it out for a big long drive earlier in the week to get a feel for it, I did have the petrol engine helping me for a lot of that, but that was a fairly long drive. The majority of the driving I've done with this car has been on petrol power, and I am about halfway through the tank, but that's after a week of really living with this car.
Alfa Romeo says the Tonale plug-in hybrid is its most efficient model yet, and even if the fuel consumption figures don't quite meet the plug-in hybrid's lofty WLTP tested figures, they're still probably not wrong. 1.5 litres per 100 Ks is the claimed figure that Alfa Romeo quotes, though that's tested with an electric motor doing most of the driving under the test. As a test, I did undertake one trip under electric power only with the car fully charged, with the dial in the car actually reading 65 kilometers as its full electric range rather than the 60.5 claimed by Alfa Romeo. After 23 Ks of actual driving, the quoted trip computer distance left was only 30 Ks, meaning you'll probably end up with a real world distance of about 50 Ks. Alfa Romeo says the Tonale boasts level 2 autonomous driving, thanks to its front camera, lane keep assist, and traffic jam assist, all joining its adaptive cruise control. Of course, it also has a driver behaviour warning and emergency braking. The Tonale scored 5 stars from ANCAP, and it has 6 airbags in it to protect passengers. Under Alfa Romeo's warranty, the Tonale is covered for 5 years or unlimited kilometres, but this being a plug-in hybrid, it also has a battery warranty of 8 years or 160,000 Ks. Alfa Romeo also offers 5 years of roadside assist.
The Tonale Veloce plug-in hybrid isn't perfect. It's just a little bit flawed, but it does look great and it's pretty fun. It also, however, costs $80,000, and unless you're an Alfa Romeo person or maybe even just an Italian car person looking for a small SUV, that's probably going to turn you off. Being a plug-in hybrid makes it that little bit more expensive, of course, but if all you're looking for is a small European SUV that does the job, if something down the line is going to work, maybe a BMW X1 is actually something you should consider. If you want something a little bit more fun, however, and don't necessarily want to spend that money, a Volkswagen T-Roc R is also something you should probably put on the list. However, if you're watching this video, a little part of me is saying that you're probably not going to be satisfied by anything other than something like an Alfa Romeo, and I reckon this one is just good enough to scratch that itch.